In 1610 a British sailing ship called the Swan pulled into the harbor at Jamestown in the New Virginia colony. Passengers included Thomas and Mary Boulding, Richard and Isabella Pace, John Rolfe, and Thomas Gates. It was a period known as the Starving Time. A different Thomas Gates, Sir Thomas Gates, had been sent to the colony to become governor and establish the charter King James had declared for a private venture to develop the colony. These investors formed the Virginia Company. The first colonists arrived in Jamestown in 1606 and built the fort at Jamestown. Survival was challenging for these immigrants, and conditions became extreme when a severe drought devastated the population. Upon his arrival in 1609, Sir Thomas found only 61 of the original 500 colonists still living. The native Algonquin tribes were also starving, and there was conflict over resources. In 1613 the 16-year-old daughter of Algonquin chief Powhatan, Matawaka, was kidnapped and later returned to the chief. The chief had a pet name for his daughter, who had been familiar with the colonists since childhood. He called her the Playful One, Pocohantas. Powhatan, to the dismay and regret of his daughter, gifted her to the colonists to strengthen relations between the tribe and the colonists. She would convert to Christianity, adopt the name Rebecca, and marry John Rolfe, who had brought tobacco plants from England to establish a tobacco plantation. The Virginia Company had offered a headright program that granted 100 acres to those families arriving before 1616 and staying a minimum of 3 years. So, in 1618, these men, labeled as ancient planters, became farmers. Thomas Gates, ancient planter, has yet to be documented as a direct ancestor. Assumptions are based on certain timelines that fit. When he was granted his 100 acres, he had yet to find a wife. As single women tended to be skittish about living alone in the wilderness. There were far more men in the colony than women, so women in England were incentivized to participate in a brideship program, with a guarantee of finding a husband in the New World. That is how Thomas met his wife Elizabeth. In 1620, Richard Pace, with the help of his friends, would be the first to complete construction of his plantation home, which he called Pace's Pains. His friends, John Rolfe, Thomas Boulding, and Thomas Gates with their families were living on the plantation until their own homes could be built. In 1621, Elizabeth gave birth to a son named John. Richard Pace had a native servant named Chanco, whom he was fond of. Tensions were high between the natives and the colonists. One day, Chanco came to Richard with a secret he was not supposed to tell. A massacre had been planned for that very day, and Chanco wanted the Pace family to escape. Richard was able to warn the colonists, but there was not enough time to prepare, and nearly half of the colonists lost their lives, including John Rolfe. Pocohantas had already died in England, leaving John a widower with a young son, Thomas. The native uprisings made it impossible to keep records, as they burned everything in their wake. There are no records to document Thomas and Elizabeth Gates and their firstborn son, John, as the ancestors of William Gates, born around 1700, married to Susanna Epps in 1727. The assumption is based on a timeline that would make sense if Thomas and Elizabeth had another son named William or James. There is evidence that their son John did not survive childhood. The timeline is based on 4 generations, starting with Thomas, including 2 documented generations of brothers, William and James Gates, and ending with our William Gates, who had a brother named James. Through these 4 generations, the Gates family shared social ties to the same families, from the time of Thomas. It was common to name children after an ancestor. The name Thomas does not show up in the direct ancestry, but the name Elizabeth does. The children of Susanna and William were William, Elizabeth, Edward, Mary, James, and Lucy. It is their son Edward, and his wife Rebecca, who are the parents of our direct ancestor, Epps Gates, and his wife Patience Robertson. The Robertson family was largely clergy and had a long history with the Gates family. Developing properties outside established boundaries was a high-risk venture in 1737. The natives grew increasingly resentful as the colonial homes slowly encroached on their own homes. Opening new territory usually came with incentives. William and Susanna's great-uncle Francis Epps IV, and his wife Sarah Kennan, who were grandparents to Thomas Jefferson's wife, Martha Wales, along with William and Susanna, and the Skelton family had been living in Prince George when property became available in Diehl Parish. Each bought property far enough from one another to be out of sight, but with the property lines touching. So, is this the original house that William and Susanna built in 1737? Part of it is definitely not, but after 2 archaeological digs, the answer is that part of it might be. If one were to walk from the back of the house through the woods, he might find the ruins of an ancient family cemetery where William and Susanna are presumed to lie in rest. It is at the end of a road called Graves Road. October 25, 1748, the sailing ship Speedwell arrived at the port of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Waiting to deboard was a 20-year-old man from Baden-Württemberg, Germany. His name was Johane Handel Diehl Vance. 4 of his brothers were waiting at the dock to take him to their home in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. They were all brethren in the Moravian Church, the oldest known Protestant sect in Christianity. In 1772, Handel, his wife Elizabeth Kessner, 5 children, and some of his siblings migrated to Augusta County, Virginia, now Rockingham County, roughly 150 miles from Chesterfield County where Edward Gates was living. Berks County, Pennsylvania borders Lancaster County, and 2 families from Berks County also migrated to Rockingham County within months of the Wentz family. One family was that of John Lincoln and his son Abraham Flowers Lincoln, and the other was James Boone. Abraham Flowers Lincoln was, of course, President Lincoln's grandfather. James Boone was the uncle of Daniel Boone, who would blaze the trail for civilization in Kentucky. By the early 1800s, all 3 of these families would have descendants living in Kentucky. When Handel moved his family to Rockingham County, quite a few Irish families were living there, and during a census the Wentz name changed to Vance. Handel's son Chrisley Christian Vance and his wife Elizabeth Warren would have a son Christopher. Christopher married Sarah Carpenter Bush and they had a son. George Washington Vance married Susan Marie Keeter, who after bearing several children, died in 1861. George would marry a younger woman named Rebecca Crabtree and they would have a son named William Joseph Vance, aka Willie J., maternal grandfather of George Melvin Gates, our father. July 8, 1776. Independence Hall, Philadelphia. Young Thomas Jefferson reads the first pages of the Declaration of Independence.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Both the Vance families, of Rockingham County, and the Gates families, of Chesterfield County, will bear witness to the American Revolution in Virginia.